Thank you all for joining us for the Active Learning and Assessment Workshop. Joining us today is Melissa Bowles-Terry, who is the director of UNLV Faculty Center. She's going to discuss how to measure your students' learning in a fair and meaningful way. I'm going to hand it over to her to get us started.
All right. Thank you so much. Really happy to be here with you today to talk about active learning and assessment and ways that you can engage your students and find out what they're learning and what they are understanding about your teaching. And I am very happy to answer questions or discuss throughout, so please do feel free to pop in any questions you have in the chat and we can stop and talk about it. So my plan for today is to talk about these two things, which are very much intertwined. We're going to talk about incorporating active learning into your class and what that looks like in a variety of settings, large classes, small classes, online, in person, etc., what that can look like in different disciplines. And then we'll talk about assessing student learning. When we're talking about assessing student learning today, just note that that's not going to be about large assignments or exams. It's going to be about formative assessment that happens like day to day throughout your classroom life. So that's the type of assessment that we're going to talk about here today. Also note that at the bottom of the slides, there's a bit.ly link that I can also put into the chat, and that will take you to a folder, a Google folder of materials that I prepared for you, including these slides. So you'll find these slides and some ancillary materials, handouts and such that you're welcome to use and peruse as is helpful to you. But that bit.ly link will stay up on the slides throughout. So if you want to go check it out, you can. So my outcomes for you today are number one, hopefully you'll be able to identify some activities that will engage your students and help meet learning outcomes, and then discover some authentic assessment techniques to identify what students have learned so far. And that so far is about the formative nature of the assessment that we'll be looking at, not end of semester summative assessment that says, okay, across the course of this whole semester, these are the things you've learned, but rather as a snapshot on this one day, what do you know so far? So, starting with active learning strategies. I want you to take a moment and imagine a 50 to 75 minute class. So just one day in the classroom. And I'd like you to think about what you want students to learn in that one day. Maybe you think about it as a lecture. Maybe you think about it as okay, on this particular day, we're talking about mandibles or something. But what is it that you want students to be able to do, discover, identify, define? So take a moment, and if you have a class that you're teaching right now or a lecture that you're preparing, please do go ahead and pop your example into the chat. I would love to see some examples if you've got them. Just be quiet for a minute and let you think and write. Okay, so maybe you have some notes, maybe you have some ideas, and you can still feel free to share those. This is a kind of a classic version of what you might imagine. This is a painting of an imagined future. So in the year 2000, this is what school might be imagined to look like. So the professor's over here on the right. He's putting books and things into a cranking machine. A student is cranking it, and students have their little Zoom headphones on, and they are getting all the knowledge out of these books into their little ears and brains. This is not actually how learning works, it turns out. And trying to deliver information, new knowledge into students' brains, you can't just crank the crank and have it enter their heads. It turns out that most of us really need to engage with ideas in some way, usually some kind of active way, in order to really integrate new knowledge. So this doesn't work. active learning is generally defined as any instructional method that engages students in the learning process. Doesn't mean they have to be up and running around. It doesn't mean games necessarily, but it does require students to do meaningful learning activities that cause them to think about what they're doing. And a lot of us who are in graduate school or have chosen an academic life, we have tended to be actually really good at like listening and learning. But if you think about what has worked for you as you have listened and learned, what is it? Do you doodle? Do you write some notes? Do you ask yourself questions as you're listening? Chances are that you are in some way like actively engaging with what it is that you're listening to in order to integrate and make use of that knowledge. And maybe you just like adapted some of those strategies on your own, or maybe you had a teacher who helped you to develop them. But what we can all do as educators is build in some of those opportunities for students to think about and do something with the new knowledge that they're getting. And if you can connect something to previous knowledge, then that's generally really helpful. So do any of you have a strategy that you usually find yourself doing in order to like integrate knowledge that you're getting from a lecture? For me, it is note taking, but I was never trained to like take good notes or anything. So usually they're pretty scribbly and it's not something that I would even refer to afterwards necessarily, but just like the act of writing, I think is like an activity that helps me use and consider and like reflect upon the information I'm getting.
You guys
Anything
can
else you
drop
can?
it in the
Yeah.
chat. Yeah, if anybody has a example for us, you can drop it in the chat and I'll read it out. But for me, for some reason, when I'm like studying, I like to be standing up and like reading the material. And I like to associate numbers with what I'm learning. Like if I'm trying to memorize numbers, I go back to like, okay, which basketball player wears that number? You know, I kind of like associate numbers with that. That's a way for me to like just hold on to the information that I learned in the lecture, I think.
It's great. Thanks for sharing that example. Right. Yes.
Yasmin said, "Oh, you can see it too.
Mhm. She
I can
says, I
read it
like
for
writing
you."
questions for topics I want to investigate further, learn the definition later. I like that a lot because that's very, very engaged. You're thinking about like, well, what do I still want to know about that? And some students, I just observed a class today, so this is on my mind, but some students who are, like the speaker upper type, they'll just go ahead and like ask the instructor, well, what about this or what about that? And, instructors often appreciate that kind of a student, but some of us are not as likely to like speak up in class. But if you're writing that down and thinking about like, well, I want to find out more about that later, you're still engaging as a learner. Thanks for sharing that. All right, so y'all can still be thinking about ways that you're doing that too. Oh, Naomi says, I like reorganizing the material differently from the way it was presented. Makes me think about it. Yes, so I think that's really cool because maybe your instructor presents it in like a written format and then you organize it like in a table or bullets or even like more visually. That's a great active learning strategy. All right, so active learning, when the instructor themselves are presenting students with opportunities for active learning, then that is shifting the emphasis from the instructor, who we have sort of traditionally thought of as the sage on the stage, the person who knows everything and is standing in front of everyone and telling them all the things. It shifts the emphasis from that instructor to the students. And so then the instructor becomes the guide on the side. So you're as the instructor, you are giving students some information, but you're inviting them to engage with it themselves. So that's a little bit of a shift. If maybe you have thought of an instructor as the holder of all knowledge, it might be a bit of a shift to think about like, well, what if an instructor is a guide, a coach? I've heard instructors talk about themselves as like they're midwives. They're helping students give birth to new ideas. So whatever metaphor works for you. I like guide on the side a lot. Active learning helps students retain and transfer information into new contexts. And it can be incorporated in any class size or delivery mode, any time constraints or discipline. It really is very flexible and it doesn't have to be a time-consuming, complicated thing. I know a lot of people, when I've taught this construct in the past, they've thought like, well, does this mean I have to create games for my class? You can. I mean, I think that gaming And gamifying learning can be a very cool way to engage students, but you don't have to go that far to just engage some active learning. So how do we facilitate it? The first thing is to start with your learning outcomes. So what is it that you want students to know or be able to do by the end of class? Students will be able to blank. So here's some examples for a 50 or 75-minute class. I come from library, so here's my librarian example. Students will be able to search an academic database using Boolean operators and or not. Or maybe students will be able to determine the pH of a liquid. If you're teaching a lab, that might be the outcome that you're looking for. It might be that they will be able to compare and contrast classical and operant conditioning. So they'll know two different ways. And then consider, what is your acceptable evidence? How will you know that students can search an academic database or determine the pH of a liquid? What would show you that they are able to do this thing that you wanted them to be able to do? How will you know they've met the learning outcome? So in our first case, they will actually be able to say like, yeah, I have 3 sources now that I'm going to use in my research paper, and I'm all set. And that's the evidence, right? Or they use a litmus test, they determine pH, you can see it, you have your evidence right there that they in fact did it. Or they design an experiment, write it out, that's going to test conditioning. So whatever your learning outcomes might be, this is a way to think about like, well, what kind of evidence would show me that students can do that? And if it's in the knowledge domain, it's like, well, I want students to know the structure of a particular kind of a jaw, say. Well, how will you know that? Are you going to have them draw it? Are you going to have them label it? So that kind of evidence, even if it is like in the knowledge domain or definitions, how will they show you that they know this new thing? So you provide students with a way to demonstrate that. And this is, I think, a really cool chart that takes us from simple down at the bottom left to complex up at the top right, just an array of some active learning activities that you can do. And down at the simple end, it's like just a pause for reflection. Let's say you're giving a lecture with slides, you can just stop and say, you know, what does this mean to you at this moment, and have students think about it and write for a moment. Or say, how does this connect to what we talked about last week? You know, just that kind of a pause, reflect, ask questions. We're going to talk some more about writing a minute paper, but you can ask students to write for 1 minute and say, what have you learned so far and what is still unclear? It's like 2 questions, easy peasy. You can have them get into a think, pair, share. So ask them to like think about a question that you pose to them. Like I asked you, what is your learning outcome for an activity? I had you do the thinking. If then we followed up with a pair, you'd get with a partner and say, well, this is the learning outcome I'm considering for my class. And they would tell you their learning activity. And then we'd have a share out. I'm sure you've done stuff just like that in many a class. You know, and we're moving up in complexity to like, oh, we could also get into case studies, interactive lectures, which would be more like asking students to contribute their ideas, et cetera, et cetera. So there's more info about this if you want to visit the University of Michigan Center for Research on Learning and Teaching. But I think this is a cool way to think about like, well, it can start really simple if you just want to add a pause for reflection for active learning. So it's important, I think, to structure this, to make this a part of your teaching practice and not just like tack it on at the end. So if you're thinking about an active lecture, you want to break up your lectures to include pauses, to ask, you know, what questions do you have so far? And I do want to advise that you phrase it that way. So sometimes, you know, an instructor will say, do you have any questions? That's a yes or no. But if you say, what questions do you have? That's an open-ended question. And I think it's more inviting because it assumes that, like, of course you're going to have questions. So please go ahead and ask them. So have a pause to say, what questions do you have? Ask a student who can summarize what we've gone through so far, add in discussions, etc. Also, building in the opportunity for think, pair, share engages students who learn in many different ways. So like we said before, some students are very comfortable breaking into a lecture and saying, well, I have a question about this or that, but not all students are like that. They may be more shy. They may just not be ready to speak in front of a class for various reasons. And giving them the opportunity to think and write first is a more inclusive practice that will engage all kinds of students at all different levels, and not just favor those who are very confident and prepared to speak up. So doing the think and then the pair and then the share out to the class is really engaging for every student and a more inclusive practice. So I really recommend that. You've all been in class discussions before, but again, that should be structured so that you have discussion questions for the class to go through. You can have students work in small groups on collaborative activities. It is important in those scenarios to assign group roles to make sure everyone participates. And it's not always the same person who's like assigned to take notes or report out, etc. Again, for inclusivity and sort of an equitable experience for everyone in the group. And problem solving, having students work through a real example can be really helpful. And reflection is such an important part of active learning because it allows students an opportunity to summarize what they've learned so far, connect it to what they've learned in the past, and think about how they're going to use it in the future. Because that connectivity, thinking about how this works with what I know and what I still need to know, that's a really important part of learning. Any questions about this? Take a breath and take a drink of water. See if you have any in the chat.
I wonder how the online learning affected active learning, you think? Like in a negative way, or is it like more beneficial for students? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that some students definitely were more engaged when we moved everything online because maybe they felt safer, more secure, like responding to questions when they weren't like face to face with an instructor, when there wasn't that like pressure to respond. And for some students, it was a very disengaging experience. You know, it just kind of depends on from person to person. It's a good question. And I think we're going to see so many studies of that in the next few years, looking at how students responded differently to a sudden shift to online remote learning. Okay, this is a really good question from Naomi about asking students meaningful concept check questions during lectures. Getting anyone to respond can be really difficult. So I think that in terms of creating like a safe space for students to respond, maybe having them write something down or respond anonymously, like on a poll, can be helpful. Like if they just do not want to speak up, you could try that. You could also have them like turn to a neighbor. Like maybe they don't want to talk in front of the whole class, but maybe you could say, all right, we're just going to do a really quick like check. What are we covering today? Talk to your neighbor and then, you know, have a couple of groups report out. Because maybe they don't feel safe talking in front of the whole class, but they could talk to like one person or two people that are right next to them. That would take a little more time than just like asking the whole class, all right, what are we covering? But it might be worth it just to build in the expectation that like, we're going to be talking in class. You're going to be talking to each other. So building that up might be helpful. So that's one thing I might suggest on that, Naomi. It's a good question. In terms of polling software, oh, you have no projector. I've used Poll Everywhere, which is free to a certain number, like 40 students or so. I also know folks who have used, this is a weird one, so I'll type it in, Mentimeter. But again, that's easier with a projector, so you can like get quick responses to something. But yeah, in a lab, I don't know, maybe just having them turn to somebody next to them, chat about it, and then report out as a group so they have like the support of their peers. You have a blackboard with chalk. It's old school. Yeah, so you got to go low tech. Just have them talk to each other, raise a hand, share out. There's also a question from Yasmin about facilitating class discussions. And I think that that is something that gets easier with practice for sure. And it's not easy when you're starting. So I think having prepared discussion questions is important. And again, if folks aren't participating, maybe you want to give the discussion questions to them in small groups and then have them report out so that they'll get used to talking to each other in a small group and then reporting out to the large group. And I think this is hard, like coming back from mostly remote and online learning, like being back in a classroom space and like talking with peers. Maybe it's something that we all need to like warm up to and sort of get used to little by little. So I guess that's another one where I would suggest maybe try it out with small groups and then have them report out. So again, they have the safety of having tried out an idea on a couple of peers before they try out their idea on the whole entire class. Something to think about. In large sections, if you're thinking about doing this with a really big class, like 100 students or something, if you have a screen, you can try polling, surveys, clickers, try Mentimeter. I think it's kind of cool to get immediate feedback in class. And that's where small groups work really well too. You can just say, turn to 3 people near you and talk about this, and then just call in a couple of groups to report out. Because in a large section, it's easy for students to just kind of get lost and not necessarily participate. And you can, our attention spans, like 10 minutes or so for a lecture before you need to like break it up and have them do something so that they're then refocused again if you're lecturing some more. So I think that is actually especially important in a large section. And then when you're thinking about online classes, online learning doesn't have to be, and it really shouldn't be, passive. So if you are doing like a live session like we're in right now, be sure to use chat to encourage student participation. You can use breakout rooms for those small discussions when you want folks to try out ideas in small groups. You can use polling and surveys, etc. And then if you're teaching an asynchronous class where you don't have this kind of a live interaction, using collaborative tools like Padlet, Google Docs, and discussion boards is important to have students like interacting with each other, interacting with the text. And I really like incorporating peer-to-peer feedback. It can make your life easier when you're grading if students are giving each other feedback on assignments first. And then you can provide your feedback as instructor. And it also gives them an opportunity, again, to engage different ideas, to think about their learning from a different perspective if they're responding to a peer's work. So those are all ways that you can think about doing this if you are online and not in a physical classroom with your students. All right, so that's active learning, but actually it's going to bleed right into assessment because this is all kind of one and the same here as we're talking about both pieces today. So question, if you are trying to teach someone to ride a bike, how will you know when they have achieved your learning outcome of learning to ride the bike? You're going to watch them ride the bike, right? So what I want to talk about is that kind of really authentic assessment that, again, it's like measuring pH levels. You want to see a student actually do that, right? And measure the pH level, show you the litmus test, show you they've found the sources they were looking for in the database. So we're going to talk a bit about classroom assessment techniques, or CATs. And this is not only applicable for like face-to-face classroom learning, but for all kinds of learning formats, online, asynchronous, synchronous, etc. So just some tools that you can use to both engage students. These are all like active learning techniques basically, but they're also providing you information and assessment on whether students know what you hope that they know. There's a thick Bible of classroom assessment techniques that was written like in the 80s. It's literally called Classroom Assessment Techniques. It's by Angelo and Cross, and it's just got reams of these kinds of quick tools that you can use. I'm going to share a few of them with you today, but classroom assessment it's learner-centered. So it's about the student, it's not about the instructor. It's formative, which, as I said in the beginning, is different from summative. It's just a quick snapshot on one day that shows you what students know right at that very moment. So that is what we're going to talk about for a minute here. Classroom assessment techniques. One that I'm going to offer you is a background knowledge check. This is something that you might do at the beginning of a class session. And if I'm teaching a lesson planning workshop, I'll hand you a lesson planning template and just ask you a multiple choice question. Do you know what this is? Do you have some idea what this is? Do you have a clear idea what this is? So in basically anything you're teaching, maybe you show students a diagram of a mandible and ask them, do you know what you're looking at here? You're not sure, you are clear, you know exactly what you're looking at. This works really well for polling, for something like Mentimeter or something like a poll in WebEx. And you can just check in real quick, and then students will see immediately like, oh, 33% of the class knows exactly what this is, 33% some idea, and 33% is lost. And it gives you an idea as an instructor where folks are and where you need to sort of pitch your material. And it also gives students an idea of like where their peers are. So a background knowledge check is a really quick way to find out what students already know about a topic, sort of before you dive in. So this would be a like beginning of class or even before class little mini quiz to just find out, what do you already know about this topic that we're going to be addressing today? The minute paper, which we talked about for a minute when we're talking about active learning techniques. This is a really easy one where maybe at the end of a lecture or a class session, you have students take out any kind of sheet of paper, even hand them an index card, and ask them to write for just 1 minute about the most significant things they learned during this session and what questions remain uppermost in their minds. And this gives you useful information on two fronts. So when you see what are the most significant things they learned during the session, you'll find out, is it what you hoped? Or were they picking up on something tangential? Like you'll find out, what did they learn that they felt was most important? What did they prioritize? And then when you find out what questions they still have, that gives you a starting point for the next class session, where you can start by saying, like, at the end of our last session, you were still unclear about, A, B, and C, or a lot of people had questions about this. So we can start there. But it gives you really valuable information that you're not necessarily going to get otherwise unless you just ask it right out. So I have always really liked ending a class with a minute paper, and it literally only has to take 60 seconds to get you a lot of useful information. But then you do have to follow up on it. So it takes 1 minute of class time and then a little bit of sorting time after class when you figure out, here are our main issues and here's what we need to address next time. The muddiest point is very similar to the minute paper, but it only asks one question. What was the muddiest point for you today? And again, that gives you great information for the next class session, where you can start by saying, a lot of you were confused about this, so let's talk about it some more. And again, like, how would you know without asking students to find out, what still needs a little more clarity, what they could use a little more time on. So I think that's also a great way to end class, is just ask what's still unclear. A defining features matrix is useful when you are talking about like 3 different topics, or more than or less than 3. So if I gave you all a sort of a lesson or a workshop on like classroom assessment techniques versus class evaluations, those student evaluations that students fill out at the end of the semester, versus final exams, and I asked you to say, like, which of these is student-centered? which of these is formative, which of these is summative, and which of these gives you a kind of a benchmark for your classes. And then I just asked you to fill out the matrix that way. Then I would find out, I mean, this is basically like a right or wrong sort of thing. I would find out if you understood these terms that we had defined through our session together. So if you have that kind of content that you're delivering, where you want students to know the difference between, my mind is blanking on 3 different things, but if you want them to know the differences between these things, have them fill out something like a defining features matrix. This is another one. It'll take 5 minutes or less. You can sort it out in 5 minutes after class, and then you'll know whether students have really grasped like the differences between these terms or these concepts and what you still need to cover. That one. This is another end of class activity that I really like. It's especially useful for a workshop actually like this, but anytime when you want students to be able to take what they learned in this conversation and consider how they're going to use it in their next class or their next course or whatever, you can ask them to transfer and apply. So on one side of the paper, they write down intriguing ideas, techniques, strategies, tactics from this conversation. On the other side, write down how they're going to apply it. So how is this going to be useful for you as you're moving on with your life after this particular workshop or session or lecture? I think that can be really quite powerful. This is the book that I've been talking about, Classroom Assessment Techniques. If you ever want to borrow a copy, come by the Faculty Center, but there's a lot of this stuff available online as well. If you search Classroom Assessment Techniques, Angelo and Cross, there are just loads of resources online where you'll find all kinds of techniques to assess pretty much anything that you are interested in finding out about. And they have disciplinary examples, so if you're in a lab or if you are in different settings, they have that all divided out. So that is the content that I wanted to sort of deliver today. What questions do you have, or what do you think you might be able to use going forward? There aren't too many of us, so if you'd like to unmute and discuss now, let's do that.
I'm personally wondering, like, when teachers assign students into groups, what is like the best size of groups? Like some teachers like to do 3 people, some do 5, some do 6. Like, is there a sweet spot for that, or it's really up to the professor or the teacher?
So I've actually read research that says 3 to 5 is the right number for a small group discussion. More than 5, and there will definitely be somebody sitting out and not really participating. So I like to keep it in the 3 or 4 range. And then I really do like to assign roles. So one person is going to take notes. One person is going to be the reporter. What are the other roles? But, like make sure everybody has a role to play. One person's going to be the summarizer, so that they're all participating and all have an opportunity to share what they know.
Yeah, because I think it's just like very common for people to just sit out and just like other people take over the group projects,
For sure. Let's see, there's a question from Yasmin about determining which classroom assessment technique to use. I think consistency, well, I like structure a lot. So I do like to, just do a regular, like we're going to do the muddiest point every, Wednesday or every Thursday, like once a week. I just want to check on the muddiest point. But I think mixing it up and using different techniques can be really useful too. But yeah, it can be really useful just so students know what to expect. You're going to ask them every Wednesday, what's the muddiest point this week? That can be kind of useful. Collaborative learning techniques. Cool. Thank you for that recommendation. I wonder if it's the same Cross, Patricia Cross. I will check that out. Yep, she's the classroom assessment techniques cross.
Should we wait a little bit more for people to ask questions if they have any?
Yeah, for sure. If you have anything else you want to ask, please feel free. Also, I put contact information here. Please note that Faculty Center is available to you. Like I said, I did a teaching observation today. It was so much fun for me because I got to go learn a lot of new things from a life sciences class that I knew nothing about. So if you need a teaching observation for your graduate teaching certificate, get in touch. And yes, we have copies of classroom assessment techniques at the Faculty Center if you want to come and borrow them. We have a small resource library with other books as well. So we're open 8 to 5. I'll put our location in here. We're Beam Hall 235, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And if you want to check out our small resource library, borrow any books about teaching, feel free. Here is the link for this folder of resources, slides, and handouts. That's it. Yeah, thanks so much. My pleasure meeting with you all. Thank you.
And before we end today's session, we would like to thank to our presenter for sharing their time and expertise with us, and to thank our participants for joining us today as well. Before you all log off, please take a few minutes to fill out this workshop feedback survey we dropped in the chat. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. I just dropped the survey once again. It helps us a lot moving forward with other workshops as well. So thank you guys for being here, and thank you so much for coming, Melissa.
Thanks.
Have a great day, everyone.